Hi guys, my name is Hannah.
And I'm Jen. And today we're in the middle of our sin series, requested by you guys. I would like to point out, because a lot of people are like, sin? You're talking about sin, like a whole series on sin? And it's like, well, we weren't going to, but we got all of these amazing comments and questions afterwards. Basically, we started out with sin. What's the big deal? And then everyone went, well, now that we know what the big deal is, how do we deal with it?
Yeah.
And so our last video, we started this talk on repentance. What even is repentance? How do we overcome sin?
Yeah.
And so we're kind of on step 2 of repentance. We started out by saying the step 1 is recognizing it, and now we're moving into this place of confessing and understanding, like, okay, now that I recognize that that is sin, like this is sin, what's the alternative? What's the better thing that I should be turning towards and living out?
Yeah. And instantly, the previous video kind of talked about David and his walk of repentance. And if you look at Psalm 51, Psalm 51 is actually his prayer of confession. That's what you're reading, which it's amazing that we get to read his prayer of confession. Yeah. And he just goes through and he admits his sin. He recognizes it. He says, God, I'm so sorry. I've been doing basically my thing. I want to set my gaze back onto you. And he's there's just such a rawness to his prayer of like, you can tell his heart is in that place. And that's one of the key things with confession is it can't just be like, I'm going to say it so that I don't get in trouble, or I'm just going to say it because then God and I are good. It's like, no, that has to be like from the heart. And a lot of times that's God actually preparing. It's that conviction that we talked about before. Conviction leads into repentance because it does that heart work inside of us. But I love what he says here, Jen, because after he's admitted all of this, he doesn't say like, oh God, please don't punish me, or like be gentle with me. But he says, against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. What do you think of that?
I love it. I love it. But I think that we have a lot of people who would really struggle with that.
Yeah.
Because I think about, I don't think we really understand that God is a just and good judge. You know, you think about our court system can be really skewed. Even how we judge one another can be really twisted and wrong. And I think that gives us a bad picture of what judgment really is all about. Because if you go into a court system or a court trial, whatever you call it, okay? And you guys know what I'm trying to say. And you know, you have this person who stole Hannah's bike. They stole Hannah's bike, they crashed the bike, and then threw it in the river to hide the fact that they had stolen and broken her bike. That person gets caught, and Hannah goes to the trial to go, okay, what's going to happen to that person? Now, the judge can do one of two things. The judge can either let that person go and be like, oh, too bad about your luck, Hannah, but I'm just going to let that person go. It's not that big of a deal. Or the judge can go, well, you stole her property, you broke it, and then you threw it in the river. So not only are you going to buy her a new bike, but you're also going to do some community service because you need to learn a lesson here, right? And I think that most of us would go, oh no, if the person was let go. There's something inside of all of us that would go, that's not okay. That's not just. That's not right. But when we hear the judge give a just, a truthful, an honest, a good verdict and go, no, you need to give her the bike, a new bike. You need to pay for that. We go, good, because it was a good judgment. And the thing is, God's judgment is always good because he is full of love. He doesn't have the twistedness, the confused thinking that we do. He can see straight into every single person's heart. He can see the whole of every single situation, and he makes a judgment based on that. Right? I love this here. Psalm 96:13 says, let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. And I think that that's such an contrary to how we generally feel, is that idea of let all creation rejoice He comes to judge the earth. How many people hear he's coming to judge and we go, woohoo! Judgment Day! No, I don't think most people think like that, but that's coming alongside his judgment.
Yeah.
Don't think about when your parents, spanked you too hard because, they got mad at you. Don't think about, the wrong judgments that can happen in this world. Think about the perfect, ultimate judgment that brings that sense of, that's fair, that's just. And I think it's hard for us to think about that when we're the ones being judged.
I was just gonna say that.
I'll let you take that.
No, that's what I was gonna say. Is like it is hard if the roles are reversed. If we're the person who stole the bicycle, we would probably be way happier if we just got let off and we're like, whew, dodged a bullet there. Like, that's our attitude. But the reality is, I remember when I was little and I took a mini bar of soap from the store because I thought that it was a sample. I didn't, it wasn't intentional stealing. But when my mom found out, she was like, oh, we have to take that back and you have to tell them what you did. And I was like, no, please don't make me. It was an accident. But she was like, no, we have to. We ended up going. They let me keep the bar of soap and it wasn't a big deal. But when I look at that, and I think that if my mom had just been like, oh yeah, not a big deal, that so easily could have sparked something in me of being like, oh, well, that's not a big deal. Maybe I'll just take one every time. What's the big deal? And now it's put this actual path of sin in my life. And in the reality, when we look at God judging, consequences for our sin never feel good.
That's right.
We've been talking about David, and his son actually died because of his sin. And yet David's attitude was still, you're right when you judge. He's a just judge. And it's the same with us. And it's God's intention is actually not to make you feel bad.
That's right.
That is not his goal at all. No. His goal is restoration, life coming back in, freedom for us. And so when there's that consequence, that fair judgment, it will always be fair, like Jen said. It actually helps us to not continue in sin, but to actually set our gaze off our own path back onto God's. And that's actually God's grace and goodness towards us in that.
Yeah. And as you were saying that, I kind of had this picture of these two paths. And it's like you had said something about the path of sin. It sets you on this path of sin if you're not actually accepting the consequences versus him putting you on the path of life.
That's right.
Which is freedom. And there's, how many of us have had a lie exposed and finally it's like, I don't have to lie about that anymore. And yes, I've dealt with the consequences, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this judgment and confession come together is when we come under God's perfect judgment, he might convict you and say, okay, it's time to go and confess this. It's time to go to that store and tell them you stole that thing, even if it wasn't an accident. It's time to fess up, and that brings you to this place of healing. But we have to come to the understanding that God's judgment is good.
Yeah.
That we can trust God's judgment, and that we actually want to do his thing, not our own.
Because I love what Isaiah says here in Isaiah 33. He says, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, and the Lord is our king. It is he who saves us. Yeah. He's not judging and being like that ruler, that judge over us to dominate or have control, because he's like, if I don't, I'll lose control of everybody. He's not like that. The whole goal is saving, rescuing us, redeeming us.
Yeah. Can I go a little longer? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm okay with it. You guys
don't have
leave,
a
I
guess. But no, it just brought back to mind this illustration that I heard one time. I have no idea who came up with it, but it's this picture of this field. Imagine a farmer's field full of lots of growing things. And what happens in the illustration is that this one section is burnt in the field.
On purpose.
On purpose. And then a year later or a month later or whatever it is, all of a sudden the whole field is set ablaze. But the one place that a person who was stuck in that field could go for safety is that place that had already been burnt. Now, bear with me, like this is going to take a little explaining, but if you have not already had your sin exposed, and if you have not already dealt with it with God, because it's not about me being able to do anything on my own, I have to go to Christ. He's the only one who has power over sin and death. If I have dealt with it with him, confessed it, done what he's asked me to do, I have this place in the field that has already been burnt that I can go to because he's already judged it. The rest of the field is on fire and ablaze. So if I have not dealt with it, I am in that blazing inferno, and it's going to hurt. And that is a consequence of me not dealing with it back here. And I don't know if that picture sums it up for you guys. It did perfectly for me. Because I want to deal with it right now. I don't want to wait a year or 2 years from now when Judgment Day comes. I'm not saying Judgment Day is coming in 2 years. I'm just putting it out there. It could be any time. And do you really want to have to deal with it while the flames are coming up, or do you want to deal with it with God on his terms now, with that mercy and that grace and Christ fighting the battle for and with you?
I love that. That's so good. That's like such a great example of this verse from Isaiah. I think that's such a good place to kind of land our plane here. But I would just really encourage you to do some soul checking right now to see if, open yourself up. We had said it in the previous video, that prayer of search me, oh God, and see if there be any wicked way in me. But in the midst of that, confess it out. If something comes to light, say, God, and maybe right now you're not like David and it's not grieving you. You're just I recognize it as sin. And you're almost maybe indifferent to it. Actually ask God to convict you of that, to spark that in your heart, that attitude of repentance, that I really don't want to continue in this. I don't want to live in this. I want to confess it, and I want to be saved from it. And
and I want to have your mindset about it.
Yes, yeah.
There's this thing where when I was younger, I prayed and asked God to help me hate sin, help me love your laws, oh God, and help me to come alongside your mind for these things. And he does. He answers those prayers. He loves those prayers. And so if you're struggling with that, ask him to change your mind, transform your thinking.
Yeah, because he will. He's a good, good God.
Cool.
Love you guys. Bye.
See you soon.